Hello, everyone. Welcome to everything you wanted to know about carbon fee and dividend. I hope you can hear me okay from here. I'm Rick Knight, Research Coordinator for Citizens Climate Education, and I'll be supervising this session, which I hope you'll find informative and rewarding. I'm joined by my esteemed guests, Alan Lerman, an economist formerly with the U.S. Treasury's Office of Tax Analysis, and author of the very important paper, Paying Dividends to American Residents from Carbon. And we usually refer to this as the Dividend Delivery Study. And Danny Richter, CCL's Vice President of Legislation and Research, who has been the brains behind much of CCL's policy development and decision-making, not to mention being a PhD ocean scientist, and he's also my boss up there in his palatial penthouse office on K Street. So here's the agenda for the seminar. In the first hour, you'll hear presentations from the three of us. First, I'll go through a brief overview of the policy, and then we'll go into detail about the three legs that support it, with each of us taking one of those legs. I'll talk about the fee assessment and collection. Alan will talk about dividend delivery, and Danny will talk about the border carbon adjustment. Then at 3 o'clock, you'll split up into 10 teams for breakouts. Everyone should have received a team number, and there should be team markers. They'll be up on the tables around the room so you'll know where to go for your breakout. Now, each team will adopt and discuss one key question or topic about the policy, either one that's already stashed in that plastic holder for the team number, or one that your group may decide you'd rather discuss, as long as it's not one that we have posted on the screen, which will have all of the pre-written questions posted on the screen. You'll have 30 minutes for that. Then we'll take a 10-minute break. You know what that's for. And when you return, someone from each team will report briefly on your question, offer your recommendations, if any, and get some feedback from the panel. Now, there's 10 teams, so this 50 minutes, each team will have 5 minutes to talk about your findings. And then when all that's done, we'll open up the floor for individual questions or for team questions that may require some additional follow-up. And finally, at 5 o'clock, we'll adjourn. And I see part of my words are not on the screen, but we'll just have to use our imaginations. So now, I'll start with an overview of the carbon fee and dividend. You know, we often talk about the three-legged stool of our proposal, kind of like this. The three legs are the carbon fee, the carbon dividend, and the border carbon adjustment. So that's how we see it. Wait, something's not right. Oh, there it goes. I'm sorry. Yeah, now it works.
It's set for now. It's not set for wide.
Yeah, it's not set for widescreen? Okay. Okay. No, let's just keep going. I think we'll be okay for now. We'll see if you can find Ricky. Okay, now it works. So let's go over the basics of the policy. We start with the carbon fee, where we place a fee on fossil fuels at the point where they enter the economy, at the first point of sale, as far upstream as logistics will allow. And next comes the dividend, where we return all of the net revenue equitably to U.S. households in order to incentivize every sector of our economy to reduce emissions. And finally, the border carbon adjustment on certain carbon-intensive imports and exports, which is aimed at both protecting American businesses from unfair foreign competition and at preventing what's called carbon leakage. In other words, fossil fuels moving to another jurisdiction where they're not taxed. The fee starts at $15 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions that will result upon combustion or other use of the fossil fuel, and it goes up by $10 per metric ton every year. And here's what that fee will look like over 20 years. The carbon fee goes up to more than $200 in 20 years per metric ton. According to the REMI study, emissions will go down by about 52% in that time. The total carbon fee dollars collected will go from about $78 billion in year 1 to about $560 billion in year 20. So how long do we keep raising that fee? It keeps going up until we have decreased emissions by 90% below 2015 levels. That would put it at about 670 metric tons per year, compared to the 6,700 in 2015. So as you can see, there will still be a long way to go. But the truth is, we are in uncharted territory. No one knows for sure how our society will respond to this. No one has ever done anything like this before. Personally, I'm optimistic that we can exceed these expectations, but we'll never know until we try. Anyway, I'm now going to dig a little deeper into the carbon fee leg of the stool. 2 words to know: assessment and imposition. Assessment is determining the amount of carbon fee that is due based on the transfer of fossil carbon in the process of selling from the seller to the buyer at the point of sale. And imposition of the fee is the process of collecting the money based on the quantity of carbon reported in the assessment. These things could be done at different points in the supply chain, and you'll see why I give them 2 different colors. The key questions are, how is the amount of fuel and the amount of carbon measured and verified? And who is responsible for reporting it to the taxing authority? And who pays the fee? Let's explore it by looking at some fossil fuel supply chains, starting with coal. Here's a simplified diagram of the coal supply chain. The arrows show the flow of coal and its products. Coal comes out of the mine, along with a lot of rocks and dirt and water, and that's called run-of-mine coal. It gets weighed and analyzed, which tells us the amount of carbon. Right here, something called a weigh feeder. And then goes to a preparation plant where it's crushed, dried, and cleaned up so it's suitable for burning. From there, it gets loaded into rail cars and shipped to customers. Mostly these are power plants, but there are also smaller users like steel mills and manufacturers who burn it for heat. A fair amount is also exported. Finally, the end products, mostly electricity or things like steel or other metals, go to consumers or end up in the products that consumers buy. Now, a part of the decision-making for where the carbon fee is assessed depends on how many of these transacting entities have to be dealt with. There are about 850 coal mines, about 500 prep plants, and about 600 power plants and steel mills. But as you can see, hundreds of millions of consumers. So that tells us these first 3 are around the same order of magnitude, which means the fee could be assessed with about the same ease at any of them. But we want to do it as far upstream as possible, so it makes sense to assess the fee at the weigh feeder, located somewhere between the mine and the prep plant. And the fee could be imposed on the prep plant operator based on the amount of carbon they receive in the form of coal. Now let's look at another fossil fuel, oil. Here things get a little more complicated. There are many hundreds of thousands of wells that connect to various size pipelines, and at certain points between these pipelines and the receiving refineries are located special devices called lease automatic custody transfer, or LACT meters. That's where the oil flow and the oil density are measured, which nails down exactly how much carbon is changing hands. Essentially, this is the first point of sale. And from there, the oil ends up going to a refinery, where it's processed into many kinds of fuels and chemicals. The fuel products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and others, are shipped by truck, by train, or barge to the consumers, which could be gas stations, truck terminals, airports, and the like. Now, back at the well, some of them also collect natural gas and pipe it to a processing plant, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And at the same time, refineries also take some liquid hydrocarbons from some gas wells, And some of the refined products down here don't get burned, they become non-fuel products. And so they will be asking for a carbon refund since they're not going to be emitting CO2 to the atmosphere. And of course, some products are exported. So how is this case different from coal? Well, first of all, there are a lot more oil wells than there are coal mines. And so it's impractical to assess a fee at every single one. The LACT meters are already set up to measure everything needed to quantify carbon, so it makes sense that the fee could be assessed here at this device. Since those data are already reported to the leaseholders, to state and local taxing authorities, and of course to the buyers, all of that data can be passed up the supply chain to just 140 or so refineries who could be responsible for paying the fee on all the oil and gas liquids they purchase. And I'll also mention imported oil, since oil is pretty much the only fossil fuel we import. The amount and composition of imported crude oil will be specified on the shipper's manifest, and there may have to be some spot checking to make sure they're not cheating, but in essence, the data needed to assess the fee will be available at the port of entry. Now, on to natural gas. The supply chain for gas looks a lot like the one for oil. Lots of wells feed into lots of pipelines. Instead of LACT meters, there are things called metering skids that do basically the same thing. They measure and analyze the gas in support of the sale. Instead of refineries, the gas is cleaned up at processing plants where they remove things like sulfur and water and some CO2. Then it goes on into high-pressure interstate transmission lines. Now, some of that gas goes directly to power plants, and others go to low-pressure distribution lines which feed homes and businesses that use natural gas. And as I said, they also take some of that associated gas from the oil well producers. Some gas may go to export, and then gas liquids go to the refinery. Okay, so the logical point of assessment is here at the metering skid, which measures all the data that you need to find out how much carbon is changing hands. And that data can be passed up the chain to the processing plant, and there are only a few hundred of those. So that's the logical carbon fee payer. Now keep in mind that these are CCL recommendations based on our current level of understanding of the technology and of the existing infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that the language of a bill will tell the same story or that such details will even be addressed in a bill. That's why we keep doing this research and talking to stakeholders, and it's one of the reasons we conduct a workshop like this, because we need to learn from each other as much as we can as the policy moves forward. Okay, so now that we've figured out how to get the money flowing from the fee payers to the carbon fund, we need to understand how that works. Let's look at the key considerations for a carbon fund. Who is in charge of it? That would be the Treasury Department or some agency within Treasury. How much does it cost to run it? That would have to include startup costs just to get the operation up and running, to get office space, buy computers, hire and train employees, and then the operating costs that will continue each year. We took a shot at estimating these costs and came up with a little bit over $5 billion in startup costs and an annual operating budget of $4 to $5 billion. I don't have time to go into details of how we came up with these, but I'll just mention a couple things. For instance, the IRS, with a budget of $11 billion, processes tax returns from 250 million taxpayers. The number of taxpayers to the carbon fund will be in the order of 2,000, so that's about 0.001% as many. Now, with the money going in the other direction, the IRS sends out over 100 million refunds each year. And every one is unique in its amount and the underlying calculations. The carbon fund will pay out a little bit more in the number of dividends, but there are just two amounts, the adult dividend and the child dividend. And finally, every American has a sense of how complicated the IRS tax code is. I think we can safely say that the carbon fee and dividend rule book will be far simpler. So that's why we feel the costs will be far lower. Now, I'll show you just one more slide to show how these administrative costs compare with the total cash flow through the program. Now, we made some assumptions to guide our estimate. We assumed that the carbon fee income will start in year one at $78 billion based on historical emissions, and then follow that $10 per ton escalation and the emissions reduction predicted by the REMI study. This will bring the annual cash flow up to about $400 billion. Where is it? Okay, $560 billion by year 20, yeah. We assume that the $5 billion startup cost is financed over, say, 15 years, and we grew the operating costs to follow population growth since there will be more people receiving dividend. Based on all this, as a percent of the money coming in from fees, the operating costs, this curve here, starts out at about 6.5%, but quickly drops off until by year 20, it's below 1% of the cash flow. Now, that's a pretty darn good overhead for any kind of operation. So with that, I'll close my portion of this hour's presentation and hand the podium over to Mr. Alan Lerman, who will brief us on the second leg of our proposal. But first, everyone should have a team number. Raise your hand if you don't have a team number. Okay, your team is 1. Anybody else? You're in 2, you're in 3. Remember those numbers? 4, 5, 6, 7. Anybody else? Okay, just remember your number and you'll see why. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Alan.
Good afternoon. I think Rick and I actually overlapped a little, so I'll try and cut out a couple of slides. Now that Rick has summarized the basics of the carbon fee, let's turn to what will happen with that revenue. As most of you already know, CCL has proposed that all the revenue be paid out to U.S. residents. But the CCL proposal did not detail how the payout would actually be accomplished. Based on my experience with income tax withholding and some tax rebates, CCL asked me to figure out in some detail how a payout program would work. Where's this? Here. Okay. Today, in 20 minutes, I'll try to explain how the dividend would be determined. I will lay out in some detail how dividends could be paid by direct government payments, and I will just mention that dividends could be paid through the payroll system. I won't have, although that isn't optimal, I won't have time to explain why that would not be a good alternative. Time permitting, I will highlight some of the complexities and issues relating to the dividends being taxable under the personal income tax, as suggested by CCL. Let's review some real basics. 100% of fees, net of expenses, will be paid to American residents as a dividend. The dividend will be the same amount for each adult. That is, the dividend would not vary by the resident's income or the resident's carbon use. Not more than 2 children per family would be entitled to a dividend. The dividend would be, for a child under 19, would be 1/2 of the adult dividend. A dependent child 19 to 23, which generally means a full-time student, would receive the full adult dividend. The dividend would be paid to the family unit rather than to the individual. Non-child dependents, such as dependent grandparents, would be entitled to the dividend like all other adults. Their dividend might be paid to the family or it might be paid separately. That has not been decided. Eligibility for a dividend will be determined by a resident's status on the last day of each month. Finally, the dividend will be taxable, but only for income tax purposes. The size of the per-resident dividend will be determined from advanced estimates of carbon fee revenue and the number of eligible residents. The dividend per adult will be total fee revenue divided by the number of eligible residents. Any aggregate over or under payments due to misestimation would be handled by adjusting the per-resident dividend in a future year. How large would the dividend be? Initially, the dividend would be about $20 per month per adult and about $10 a month per eligible child. The dividend would increase each year as the carbon fee increased, but the increase would be mitigated by reductions in fossil fuel usage. After about 20 years, it is estimated that the monthly dividend will be about $130 per adult and $65 per eligible child. Basically, there are two possible methods for paying the dividend. First, by direct monthly payments to residents, paid either by the Treasury or by a contractor acting on behalf of Treasury. This would be similar to how Social Security benefits are paid, except that dividends would be paid to family units rather than to individuals. This is the method I'll discuss mainly today. Alternatively, dividends might be paid by increasing net wage payments. Think of it as reverse withholding. However, for residents who do not work or receive pension-type payments, an add-on direct payment program would also be necessary. While possible, this dual method would be complex and burdensome, and there is not sufficient time for me to go into that today and explain its deficiencies. The CCL proposal, and I'm telling you something and I'm repeating it a little bit, so you should try and absorb it. The CCL proposal specifies an equal dollar amount dividend for each adult resident and half dividend for up to 2 children. That suggests paying the dividends to family units rather than to individuals. Most residents already supply necessary demographic information to the government annually on income tax returns. That suggests using income tax return information as a starting point so the residents do not have to submit the same information again. Of course, residents who do not file tax returns would have to submit similar information. Even though demographic information from tax returns would be used, because of its vast responsibilities but limited resources, we suggest the IRS should have only very limited involvement in the dividend system. We suggest either a different government agency, a separate government agency, or private contractors to handle as much of the administration as possible. For tax filers, most of the required information about dividend eligibility would already be provided on income tax returns. Non-filers would have to supply similar information, and both filers and non-filers would have to provide information about their desired withholding. If actual payments did not match the entitlements, there would have to be an annual reconciliation. In addition to income tax returns, residents would use up to 3 new forms to supply information. A withholding form for residents who file tax returns, which would usually only have to be submitted once unless the resident decides to change the level of withholding. An information withholding form for residents who do not file tax returns, obviously that would have to be filed annually, and an annual reconciliation form that both filers and non-filers would use when, but only when, their monthly dividend payments do not equal the amount to which they were entitled. It is probable that providers of tax preparation software, such as TurboTax, would include these new forms in their tax packages. That would greatly reduce the form completion and filing burdens for residents. There we go. Here is a possible form for providing withholding information. It is very similar to the form that Social Security and pension recipients currently submit to request withholding. It is also somewhat similar to the Form W-4 that workers submit to their employers for withholding from wages and salaries. Aside from identifying information and a signature, all that is required is a statement of the desired withholding rate or that no withholding is desired. That's, well, I guess it's dead. Okay, that's a federal income tax withholding box. We get it? There it goes. I mean, I just picked out 4 different rates. You can have your pick of whatever you want in there. Obviously, the withholding rates are only samples. If there were a default withholding rate, which might be practical, Only residents who wanted a different withholding rate would have to file this form. This form would be submitted once unless the resident wanted to change withholding. Note that this type of form would be necessary only if dividends were subject to income taxes. Residents who do not file income tax returns would have to file a form with their family status and contact information, as well as withholding information. Thus, they would not have to file a separate request for withholding. To prevent anxiety about dealing with IRS by these typical low-income folks, non-filers would probably submit this information to a different agency than IRS. The claim for carbon fee dividend form is similar in layout to an income tax form, but does not include any information about the resident's income. The top portion contains typical identifying information. The bottom portion is for necessary legal information. Only the middle portion has information needed for the dividend. This part of the form contains the names and Social Security numbers of dependents. This information helps determine the number of eligible residents. Bank account information is needed for depositing the monthly dividend into residents' bank accounts. Residents without bank accounts generally would receive their dividends by debit card, or in a few cases, by monthly check. Line 8 indicates whether an annual reconciliation form is attached. This line would not be on the form for the first year of its use. In later years, it would flag the inclusion of a form for reconciliation. Line 9 has information about desired income tax withholding. That's the analog of the dividend form for tax filers. Oh, where we go here? This isn't advancing. There we go. For any of several different reasons, the dividend payment actually received for a month might not be the exact amount to which the resident family is actually entitled. For example, there will be a delay in including the dividend for a newborn child in the monthly payment. When that happened, but only when that happened, reconciliation would be required. Reconciliation will be done once a year and will be initiated by completing a form which will be filled out and filed as an attachment to the family's income tax return or claim for carbon fee dividend. Over and under payments for the year, as shown on the reconciliation form, would get carried to the income tax return and would increase or decrease their tax refund or balance due, or possibly their future monthly dividend payments. Come on. Go back one. Here is a possible version of a reconciliation form. The separate row for each month helps determine the number of eligible dividend units for that month in half and whole numbers. That is, half units for children under age 19 and whole units for other eligible residents. The total number of eligible units for the month gets multiplied by the per adult monthly dividend amount and gets entered into the rightmost column. The monthly eligible amounts are then total for the year. The last few lines of the form compare the amount to which the family is eligible with the amount to which they actually received in direct payments. This is the longest possible version, most complex possible version of this form. If the dividend for non-child dependents were paid to them directly rather than to the family that supports them, the column outlined in red would be eliminated. If the per resident dividend were the same for every month of the year, the multiplication would not be necessary, and the two columns outlined in green would be eliminated. Here is the simpler reconciliation form with the red and green columns eliminated. Note that if non-child dependents receive their dividends separately, they would have to file claims for their dividends, just as people who are not covered by income tax returns have to do. This is a summary of the actions that residents would take under the direct payment system. Except for the items shown in red, tax return filers and non-filers would take exactly the same actions. They would claim their dividends by filing either a tax return or a separate claim for dividend form. They would file withholding information. They would receive monthly dividend payments. During the year, they would initiate any necessary changes or corrections. Finally, but only if necessary, they would file for reconciliation and then receive or pay the reconciliation amounts. This diagram presents the actions of residents in another way. The blue boxes show the actions by resident. These are the same actions listed on the preceding slide. The green boxes show the actions by the government or its contractors, which are transparent to residents. We can come back to this in a larger size version if we have questions later. Conceptually, the direct payment method is not complex. However, once we consider coverage for non-filers, information for withholding, and reconciliation, the direct payment method is definitely not simple. The direct payment system would require significant funding and workers to set up and to operate annually, and I think Rick's comments about the cost are probably about right. I attempted to do an estimate without looking at the collection side, just the payout side, and I came up with numbers about this. I think once the system was running, it might be slightly cheaper than we estimate, but I think you have to allow for the fact that it could be expensive. But again, Rick's point is that, that's an excellent point, that it may start around 6 or 7% of revenue, but the cost will generally not rise very much over time, whereas the revenue will, and it will go down to something like somewhere between 0.5% and 1.5% of revenue after about 15 or 20 years. Again, I'd like to put in a plug that whoever administers the system is a policy decision for Congress. I would, however, respectfully suggest that as little as possible the administration be tasked to either the IRS or the Social Security Administration. Both of those agencies have very, very vast and varied responsibilities, but have been given relatively limited resources. In order to make the carbon fee and dividend system revenue neutral, which is a goal of the CCL proposal, dividends would have to be taxable, at least for purposes of scoring for the government budget. Dividends could be made non-taxable by specific legislative provisions included as part of the enactment of the carbon fee and dividend system. CCL does not envisage such an exemption. However, it does assume that dividends would not be considered as income for most means-tested social programs. Apart from statutory budget requirements, the main benefit of taxation of dividends has to do with our progressive income tax system. Generally, lower incomes are subject to lower marginal income tax rates. As a result, after paying their taxes, lower income residents would keep more of the dividend payments and have more after-tax income from the dividends than those with higher or high incomes. Effectively, taxation tilts the after-tax benefits of dividends towards those with lower incomes. Conversely, as we shall see in a minute, some lower and middle-income residents can be subject to extremely high marginal taxes on their dividends. As already mentioned, taxation requires withholding, which is burdensome for residents and the government. Under the direct payment method, residents have to figure out what the withholding should be. Guessing wrong or not guessing at all could lead to substantial over or under withholding. Paying balances due when there is under withholding may cause its own problems, especially for residents who do not have the funds to pay the tax. That often leads to problems with the IRS. Problems should definitely be underlined several times. Even if taxpayers prefer to be overwithheld, substantial overwithholding denies families the use of the dividends until after the end of the year. Thus, aggregate overwithholding could result in fiscal drag on the economy. The CCL proposal promises that 100% of net carbon fee revenue will be returned as dividends. Residents' doubts about the 100% return could be severely exacerbated if dividends were taxed. That could lessen support for or even increase opposition to the carbon fee and dividend program. Here are the details of an example of a hypothetical middle-income family for which the combination of federal and state income taxes take virtually all the family's dividends. Don't try and read the small numbers. I'll give you a summary in a minute. This is a 4-person family over age 65, but with 2 dependent children. Think of grandparents raising grandchildren. The family has income of $38,000 from earnings and $12,000 from Social Security for a total of $50,000. The family receives a carbon dividend of just under $2,400. That is $66 a month for each adult and $33 a month for each child. The family faces a very high marginal tax rate because receipt of the dividend causes the phase-out of their earned income tax credit and the phase-in of the taxation of their Social Security benefits. Federal income taxes for this family take almost 60% of the dividends. State income taxes add an additional almost 40%. The combined total marginal rate is 99.67%. Thus, this family will be left with only about 1/3 of 1% of their dividend. In dollar terms, after taxes, the family keep only $8 out of $2,376 of dividend. Although this is definitely an unusual and infrequent example, the point of showing it is that it is possible. Taxability of the dividend could leave some families with essentially nothing. Recall that the CCL proposal treats dividends as income only for income tax purposes. If dividends were permitted to be treated as income under various means-tested programs, there would be many more situations in which income taxes plus the loss of benefits would be substantially more than the dividends, thus making families worse off because they receive the dividends. Come on. Okay. In conclusion, there are 2 possible methods of paying the dividend. Neither is simple, but the direct monthly payment method is far simpler. Only the government and residents are involved. It would be easier to get nearly 100% coverage. All residents receive their dividends in the same manner. Dividends would be more visible to residents, as people would understand that they're getting their fees returned to them. And it would be easier to recover overpayments. Paying the dividend through employers is possible, but it would require a supplemental direct payment system and would have many other complexities. Finally, dividend payments would be much less visible. Taxation of dividends adds complexity, largely because of withholding. On the one hand, our progressive income tax system can tilt aggregate after-tax benefits towards lower-income residents. Conversely, taxation can be very inequitable due to very high marginal rates for some lower and middle-income families. Oops. Okay, now I'll turn it over to Danny to finish up about the rest of the system. Here's the clicker.
Thank you.
Let's see if we... Where is it? Oh, okay. No, that's not it. Where did it go? Hey, Ricky, are you here? Or Brian?
So while Rick is setting that up, I'll just say how excited I am to be here at this session and to have already heard these 2 sessions, because you may not have this, but over the last many years since we've started doing this policy, there have been many times when somebody asks me a question and I don't have the answer. And then I get a look from them, and I know this look. It's kind of a tilting of a head and wide eyes, like you really should have known this. And maybe they'll throw in a little head shake and an out breath of breath. And so you've seen that look. And the message that I get is you really should know the answer to that question. And now, when I have the answers to which really Rick and Alan have provided, which you just had, instead of getting that, I get kind of, they stick out their chin a little bit. Maybe they do kind of sort of a pout, like there's some nodding of the head, and it's interesting that they pout a little bit. It makes them look very sagacious and wise, but pouting is really something children do. And so, but that's the look I get more often, just kind of. So I really am excited. What you're doing here, you may not have known it, but you're seeing answers to a ton of questions that we've been getting. And with these talks, instead of seeing, you should be able to see after this. So that's that. And so now we're going to get into the last part. This is the border adjustment. And this is the last little part. All right, so the border adjustment, that's me. So we're going to go a bit quick here. So we're going to cover a review of what the border adjustment is, the border carbon adjustment, why members of Congress care about the border adjustment, what is CCL's ideal case here, why reality is not ideal, a little bit of perspective on United States exports, which hopefully you can bring to your member of Congress. We'll talk a little bit about benchmarks, and I've actually removed the miscellaneous legal issues. So what is CCL's border carbon adjustment? Well, this is the figure that I created using my considerable control over boxes and filling in those boxes in PowerPoint. You can notice the design element here. But the red line is the United States border. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. There we go. I'm just pushing buttons and causing trouble. I was trying to get the laser pointer here.
Oh.
It's the middle button.
It's the middle button, the big one. Where's the... There we go. All right. There we go. So here, this red line here, that's the border. Here's our flag on this side. So this is the United States border. And the way our policy is set up is you have fossil fuels, all the blue boxes, that's the carbon fee. So the carbon fee is placed on fossil fuels which are mined and consumed here in the United States, fossil fuels which are mined and exported from the United States, and imports of fossil fuels. Those all bear the fee. Carbon-intensive goods. Carbon-intensive goods produced domestically, nothing is done with them. But for carbon-intensive goods which are produced domestically and exported, that's where we're doing the border carbon adjustment. We're also doing the border carbon adjustment on carbon-intensive goods which are produced in a foreign country and imported to the United States. So that's what our border carbon adjustment is. And I really want to emphasize that these are going into two separate pots. So the blue box is the carbon fee on fossil fuels. That's here. That's what goes to the dividend. In a separate pot, because we have a trade deficit, that means that we import more than we export. That means that we're actually collecting the border carbon adjustment on more goods than we're rebating back to as you export. We do expect a small surplus from the border adjustment, and that is not allocated. We don't say where that should go. We're leaving that up to the members of Congress who are going to introduce this. We think that's important. So why do members of Congress care about this at all? Well, all members of Congress care about the United States economy. They do. However, they care about the piece of the economy that is based in their district just a little bit more. And if you can tell a member of Congress that the main goods or important goods which are produced in her district are eligible for the border adjustment, she'll be more likely to support the proposal. And so the goal of this talk is to give you some tools to say if such goods are produced in your district and if they will be eligible for the border adjustment. If they're going to be eligible for the border adjustment, that's good from the perspective of that member of Congress, because that means they're going to be at no competitive disadvantage with goods imported from foreign countries, or if that business wants to export their products to another country. So what is our ideal case here? Our ideal case actually is that we never need the border adjustment. We never have to use this. So Rick talked a little bit about the administration of collecting the fees. Alan talked a lot about the administration of the dividend. We don't really know exactly how you would administer a border adjustment. What we do know is that it would be really complicated. And if at all possible, we don't want to do it at all. So if everybody adopts our carbon price or international agreements clearly identify equivalencies, then we don't have to implement a border adjustment at all. Right now, even though many of you know there are many countries that do have carbon prices in place, fees, taxes, or caps, none of them have a border adjustment because it's very complicated. Now, the next best from not having to do this at all would be an accurate and low-cost adjustment for every good that is exported or imported from the United States. And of course, with our policy, except for fossil fuels leaving the United States. However, this is more the ideal case. We're probably not going to be in the ideal, and if we do get away from the ideal, our priorities are number one, stable climate, always. Number two, simplicity and low cost. Number three, fairness. And number four, transparency. We want people to be able to look under the hood of this thing. Reality is not ideal. The reality is that complexity and cost constrain what we can actually do. International agreements, international trade, and goods traded are all very complex. And if you want to collect information on that complexity, that's going to cost money. Either the business is going to be paying it, governments are going to be paying it, or consumers are going to be paying it. And so in reality, only certain goods are likely to be border adjusted. And even then, it's probably only going to be approximate. So here are two resources which you can look up. There's a little bit.ly link, and this is very similar to, this is almost identical to the talk I did, Borders 2. It's a CCU. It's available on Citizens Climate Community, CCL Community. There we go. So this one on the left, this is a report, an interagency report done by several agencies in 2009. This was when the ACES bill, Waxman-Markey, was being discussed in Congress. And this one to the right is very, I found it's really excellent. It's 20 pages, has a lot of great info on considerations for the border, both for WTO legality and the details. So I'm going to be drawing from these two reports. And I just want you to know we're entering the hypothetical. And so we don't really know what the border adjustment entails until the law is passed. And even then, the details probably won't be apparent for quite some time. So a lot of what you're hearing today, what you've already heard, this is really on the backside. After the bill passed, this is for the regulators to figure out how do we actually make this work. Having these studies, having these reports, that's going to help demystify things for the members of Congress, going to give them more confidence, and also it's going to help with the regulators, giving them a place to start and say, do we really want to do this? Do we really want to implement it this way? So we're not going to specify it in the following. We can't do that, and it won't. Our purpose here is to generate political will and empower citizens. We are not actually a think tank, so that's an important distinction. So another thing, grappling with reality, that a lot of the work that has been done here has been in the context of cap and trade. Now, there's been a lot more research there, and in the legislation that which you see has been submitted, there is a focus on these carbon-intensive goods. And I think that this might be a cap and trade legacy. We're kind of constrained by this, but if you think about it, with a cap, you have to say, all right, we're relying on foresight. We're looking into the future. How much do we think people are going to export or import this year? And for those goods that are sensitive, let's give them free allowances based on this guess. But with a fee, you rely on hindsight. You're saying, all right, how much do we export? We made an estimate, but how much should we actually export? And then you treat it as a simple overpayment or underpayment of tax, which we do all the time. And as we all know, hindsight is 20/20. So there's a lower probability for error causing either windfall profits or magnified losses. This is good for companies. This is good for emissions. And there's reason to believe that more industries would be covered. That being said, I'm still going to focus on what is out there, what is published, even though I do think we could go cover more industries. We're going to stick with the industries which are commonly listed. So some considerations: energy intensity is how much energy is required to produce a given amount of stuff. This could be energy intensity per units, so how much energy per million widgets. It could be by weight, how much energy per million pounds, how much energy per dollars, per $1 million. Greenhouse gas intensity is the same, but instead of energy, it's greenhouse gases emitted. And trade intensity, or trade exposure, is how much of the total value of an industry comes from exports. So of all the money that they're making, how much did they get by selling to foreign countries? So now what that interagency report established was that energy or greenhouse gas intensity of 5% or greater means it's a presumptively eligible industry. It's presumed to be eligible for a border adjustment. For a trade intensity of 15% or greater, 15% or more of their product is going to other countries, that's when they're presumed to be eligible for a border adjustment. And this is just a figure to show. This is the greenhouse gas intensity or the energy intensity of different economies. So there's already an estimate of this. We're not starting de novo here. And we also actually have to define emissions here. This is how much fun the border adjustment is. There's Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 is direct. This is the person who controls the coal plant. There's Scope 2. These are energy-related indirect emissions. So if you're buying electricity, those would be Scope 2 emissions. And then Scope 3, these are all indirect emissions not covered under Scope 2. Very specific, I know, but this would include transportation. So if you're transporting your goods, those would be Scope 3. Ideally, we want all that included. We do want the fuel you're burning to get goods from one place to another. In reality, we're probably only going to be able to get Scope 1 and Scope 2. So here's a little bit of perspective on how big of a pie we're talking about. How much do we export? On average, energy expenditures accounts for 2% of the value of U.S. manufacturing. So only about 2% of the value of the good would be subject to increases due to the carbon fee in the first place. But 75% of all manufacturing output are industries with energy expenditures below that 2% value. Most manufacturing in the United States is actually pretty energy light. It's not that energy intensive. Fewer than 10% are presumptively eligible, meaning that greater than 5% of their energy intensity is the value of the good is worth less than 5%, final good. And here this is as a chart. The charts in the interagency report are really terrible. And so I tried to make things big here, but on the x-axis you have the cumulative share of value. So this is value, and then this is the energy intensive. And you can see that there are just a few industries representing a pretty small, relatively small amount of value who have these very high energy intensives. The average is 2%, and most are below 5%. There are only actually 44 industries that are presumptively eligible, and that's the North America Industry Classification System, or NAICS, and 8 are in the primary metals sector, 13 are in the non-metallic minerals sector, 4 in the paper sector, 12 in the chemicals sector. And so if you look at bills which have actually been submitted and the language they include, first of all, they're very similar. So here, the blue text, these are the parts of these two sentences, these two paragraphs that differ. And what are they highlighting? They're highlighting iron, steel, steel mill products, including pipe and tube, aluminum, cement, glass, flat, container, and specialty glass. Same over here. Van Hollen thought there should be an S here. McDermott said no S. And if you go back here you have it again. Primary metal sector, aluminum and steel, non-metallic minerals, cement and glass, paper, chemicals. They're getting this from this report. This is the source of the language for this. And even though one of those is cap, one of those is a carbon fee, they're using the cap and trade framework. So that's just to highlight this.
What report was that?
It's the interagency report. It was the one on the left. And so here are the sectors. Here's their trade intensity, 33, 11, 19, 21, 34. The greenhouse gas intensity, 1.3, 0.7, 2.7, 2.3. So most of these are presumptively eligible not because of their greenhouse gas intensity, but because of their trade exposure. So that's another important point. I'm going to skip this one because we're low on time. And then focusing in on these 44 out of 600 again, how many people do they employ? Well, there's 780,000 workers, which is 6% of employment, which is 0.5% of total. That's 99.5% of workers do not work here. 88% of manufacturing employees work in industries with energy intensities below 2.5%. So they wouldn't be subject to the border adjustment, but they just don't have that much energy intensity. And then the revenue of these 44, that's 12% of total output, but that is less than 2% of GDP. So just perspective, what is 90% of the United States GDP comes from domestic sales. We mostly sell to ourselves. So, and this is the portion that is not going. This is what the North America Industry Classification System is. If you want to go to bed at night, you can find this presentation, just read this. It's better than cheap. Here are our biggest trading partners and how much of these trade-intensive goods go there. Here's the European Union. They have a cap and trade. Many of them have carbon fees or taxes. Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. Japan has a carbon tax. Canada, of course, they're going to carbon price nationwide of $50 or less by 2022. Mexico, they have a carbon tax. China, they have a cap and trade. They're going in certain provinces. They're going to all. India, they have a coal tax, which doubled when Modi came into the presidency, and here's others. Most of the people we export to or import from already have some sort of carbon pricing. They want us to do this. So if these industries are in your district, if they're in there, it will definitely be border adjusted. You can reassure your member of Congress, if any of those industries are in your district, they will be border adjusted, those jobs will be protected. If not, I would say that it has a better chance of being border adjusted with a carbon fee within a cap or regulation. And I am out of time, basically, so I'll skip over benchmarks. But benchmarks, the bold text, this is also for sleeping, but here's a letter soup. ISO standards, WB, CDS/WRI. These are existing methodologies for arriving at benchmarks. We're not starting from zero here. There are already people who have figured out how do you figure out the carbon emissions, the benchmarks of these industries, of these goods. And right, and so this is just for an industry, for a country. What do you say? If you can't get it exactly right, here's an average, and actually having an average might be good. If you have an average, in certain situations, you're going to overcompensate those who have lower emissions, you're going to undercompensate those who have higher emissions, but on the flip side, it's reversed. So imports versus exports. So there's a lot of complexity here. And I said, we were in the hypothetical, and so we're exiting the hypothetical. There's no more dragons. We're back into the realm of cows, sheep, chickens, pig, all lovable and cute. Some open questions that still need to be figured out. How much of this needs to be in the text that passes versus how much needs to be figured after? I think most of it figured after. What to do with any carbon trade surplus, so that because that extra pot of money, that second pot, what do we do with that? Will we ever need the border adjustment? I hope not. And how far down the carbon intensity supply chain will we be able to go? Are we stuck with those carbon intensive industries, or can we go further? Can we go after those scope 3 emissions? And then that last one was a section I cut. So our ideal, no border adjustment. This could actually be possible. A cap at the border relies on foresight. A fee relies on hindsight. Hindsight is 20/20. There's a lot CCL can't and won't know about the border adjustment until it's actually implemented, but despite that uncertainty, they're still going to make you look really good with your member of Congress if you can say, you've got an aluminum pipe manufacturer in your district. Well, they're going to be subject to they're going to be eligible for the border adjustment. That will help. So that's it. So I'll turn it over to Rick.
Thank you, Danny. We're not going to take questions right now because it's a little bit past 3 o'clock and we need to move on to the second part of our session. And while I go and find another part 2, here we are. Okay, so now we're going to have our breakout session. Everyone should have gotten a team number. Does anyone not have a team number? You're in team 10. You're in team 1. Anybody else? It's a 9. Yes. Somebody caught that and put lines under all the 6s. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Each team is going to debate and formulate a response to one policy question or topic, either the one that is provided at the table where you see your team number there in a little plastic tent. There will be hidden behind the team number is a question. Or if your team decides that you would rather as a group address some other question, you may do that as well. And you'll have 30 minutes to do this. Now, there's another slide that I have here. that has a list of questions that we have pre-written and that are associated with these team numbers. So if you do want to come up with your own question, make sure it's not one of these. And with that, you'll have 50 minutes to do team reports after that half hour of debate. Each team will have about 5 minutes to report out and ask a few questions. And then we'll have an open forum where you can ask all those questions you've been just dying to ask myself, Alan, or Danny, if you can remember them by then. So, yeah, I'm gonna leave these up here. So please go find your team number.
Team 9 is here on the second table, team 10 on the second table.
Yeah, David will.
In the back of the room.
I think we'll have about 8 people per team. I did the count right, but it's time for your discussions to end, and we're going to now have report outs from the teams. Thank you. 3:40 is the time, and now it's time to hear from Team 1. David Holmquist has got a microphone, and he's going to bring it to the team. Now you have 5 minutes to tell us what your question was, what your findings were, what your ideas were, and maybe ask 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll go on to the next team. Okay, who wants to speak for Team 1?
So, Team 1's question was not exactly what was up on the screen. It was, all along the supply chains for oil and gas, there are significant amounts of methane fugitive emissions. CCL wants the carbon fee and dividend to cover those upstream emissions, but there is no consensus on verifiable methods to measure such leakage. How should we address this? We came up with 3 approaches and a couple of comments. The 3 approaches, and the one I'd say we had a lot of enthusiasm for, was the methane X prize. So we'll put, name a number, $10 million on the table to come up with a way to measure and reduce the emissions. First measure, but hopefully reduce. We would want this to produce the least costly, most accurate, peer-reviewed way to do this. Number 2, and we would note that X prizes have been very productive in other situations. Number 2, we'll just assume you're releasing X percent, say 10%, and we'll tax you on it. Well, that doesn't sound too good, because that would create opposition that maybe we don't need to create. So we would suggest a phased-in assumption. This year, we'll assume you're releasing just a little, next year it's a little more, and so on. And that would produce a way for the companies to understand what they had to do. Number 3, we'll tax it unless you, the industry, can come up with a standard and certification to tell us how much it is. In other words, let's engage the industry. This is a market force. You produce a way that we can measure it. In other words, this is a little different from the X prize. You come up with a way to certify it, and let's use the industry knowledge to do it. Now, our comments at the end were, we thought that this was really important because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. But we noticed, because somebody had a really good cell phone that could produce Google, that this specifically talked about supply chains for oil and gas. And this is not the largest, not the majority of fugitive methane emissions. Energy sources produce, according to, I think it was EPA.gov, 40% of the methane. Farming or agriculture produces 31%, and waste management produces 29%. So you've got 60% that we didn't even discuss, and we got off on farming, and that produced a lot of interesting questions.
Wow, what an excellent result from your discussions. And we can, after we get done with all the team reports, we may come back to that and just take general questions from the audience on it. Okay, where's team number 2?
The question that we had to answer was CCL seeks to get dividends to all U.S. residents, including those who are undocumented. Given the reluctance of such undocumented residents to reveal themselves to the government, not to mention the politically sensitive nature of this issue, how should we address it? It's a tricky question. The undocumented don't want people to know where they are. And they may have a phony social security number, they may have no social security number, and they may not be paying taxes. So the suggestions that the team came up with was that under a carbon fee and dividend system, theoretically, we should have a database of people who have social security numbers that are getting a dividend or have an address on a household that are getting dividend checks. Okay, so there's a database there that we can compare against to. This could be done at a federal level, or it could maybe more effectively be done at the state level, where some percentage, some appropriate percentage of the dividends would be allocated to the states on the basis of estimates of how many undocumented aliens or citizens, not citizens, but how many undocumented there may be allocated across the states. That pool of money would be administered by the state. Somehow it would have to be insulated against federal government oversight to where if you had an electric bill or if you had a natural gas bill and you were an undocumented, you could either mail it in or go into some place to collect a payment, a share on a monthly basis. It's not perfect, but it would ensure that there would be some payment out to undocumented that way. And that could be compared against the database of people with social security numbers and their addresses, or people who are filing tax returns or have filed the carbon fee and dividend W-4, or people that are getting a check by their address. So you compare one against the other to make sure there's no double dipping, and that's how we would suggest doing that.
Wow.
Now, what did I miss? Do I miss something?
Thank you very much. And I agree, that is a really tough question we've been wrestling with, which is a sneaky way that we've tried to get ideas for dealing with these questions by having this workshop. Okay, now time for team number 3. To this distinguished gentleman who will now tell us.
Yeah, our question was, many children are not in traditional households, but are placed in foster care or in various kinds of institutional care. How should the dividends for those individuals be handled in such cases without creating incentives for fraud and abuse? So right now, Carbon Fee and Dividend, our proposal has a cap for traditional families, nuclear families, a cap of 2 kids, each of whom get a half share of a dividend. And so actually we started off with a discussion of that and sort of where that had originated and the likelihood that that may actually become troublesome in passing actual legislation because of opposition from groups who typically tend to be strongly in favor of large families. So,
could you speak a little louder, Horton?
Yeah, we got into a discussion of where the 2-kid cap came from and the fact that this might cause trouble with passing legislation due to opposition from groups that tend to favor large families. But that really isn't the question we're supposed to be answering. Then we also got into discussion of how foster kids are treated in the tax code. Are they listed as dependents on the foster parents' tax returns? And the answer to that was we had a fast Google search which answered that for us, which is no, they are not treated as dependents on the foster parents' tax returns. So from a tax perspective right now, they're actually treated almost like independent players, right? I mean, they're their own entity. We then really got down to brass tacks here and thinking about different options of how to treat foster kids. It may be difficult to keep track of them because of the fact that they're not handled on the tax returns as dependents the way they are in a traditional family. But one option would be, since each of them is sort of an independent player from the point of view of the tax code, would be that each foster kid gets a half share, which then goes to the foster parent. That doesn't really treat the kids as getting the money, but of course you wouldn't be giving them the money anyhow. Another option was that foster kids and kids in orphanages just don't get a dividend at all, and are effectively skipped from the dividend payment. And then the third option is that if you have a foster family, the parents, from the goodness of, from their own goodness, are doing a service to society by keeping these kids. So it seemed a little unfair that a traditional family with biological children should get their effectively like a third person, right? Because they're getting 2 half shares. So they're effectively getting 3 portions of the dividend. Why shouldn't the foster family also get that? And I think that final answer, even though it may be difficult to track because of the way foster children are handled in the tax code, it's not as seamless. In spite of the difficulty of tracking it, I think had the biggest consensus in terms of how to handle specifically foster kids, but kids in orphanages, I think that's a tricky and messy situation, and I probably would say myself that they just don't get the dividend until they reach maturity and are no longer institutional care.
Okay, thank you, Wharton. I just want to say that after all the teams report out, we're going to go back now and have the panel make a few comments about some of these issues, because Alan certainly wants to have something to say about that issue. Yeah, let's go with Team 4 now, and then we'll find out what you folks have discovered.
Hello there from the very back of the room, and my name is Brian Etling, and for 6 years I was involved with a Toastmasters group in St. Louis, Missouri, where I would regularly engage folks that were very skeptical about climate change. And I actually gave a speech, and it's actually recorded on YouTube, and so I went through carbon fee and dividend, and after I was done, I had this 5-minute question and answer period, and this is actually the question I got from a climate skeptic. They said to me, quote, "If our goal is to move away from fossil fuels, and as we use less and less fossil fuels, wouldn't there be less money for the dividend?" And she kind of elaborated, this is how she originally asked the question here too. She said, "How do you foresee the dividend program continuing when the projection is that the fossil fuel usage would decrease? As a result, one could see that there would be less money to return to households, and eventually it would not be able to sustain the increased cost of fuel." So I guess she was trying to ask that at the end of 20 years, so you'd have this increased cost of fuels and everyone's switching over, how would the money cover it? Was I think was the question from somebody that was skeptical of climate change and the solution.
Okay. So that was the question you decided your group would address, would
Absolutely, a question from a climate skeptic in the real world.
Okay. As I said, we'll hold the discussions until after we get everybody's reports, and then we'll come back to this. Thanks, Brian. Okay, team number 5.
So the question was, some fossil fuel supplies, particularly crude oil, is refined into products that don't get burned, like asphalt, carbon fibers, or chemicals used to make polymers. Should the carbon fee be rebated at some point, and if so, what's the best way to do this? Our conclusion was, yes, there should be a rebate for any non-fuel uses where the end use does not result in significant release of greenhouse gases. We had quite a bit of discussion about polymers and do they break down and how fast and what happens to what comes out of them when they break down, and that took us down a lot of roads. And what happens with fertilizer, and is it only when it gets put on in excess that it so anyway, there's a lot of discussion. How to do this? Apply for the purchaser of the petroleum applies for the rebate, and the application is made to. We thought the carbon fund would be the place to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That's from Team 5, and again, we'll come back to that. We'll get our little brains thinking, and now on to Team 6.
All right. Sorry for back to you. So our question was, there are methods to capture carbon dioxide and sequester it deep underground. The carbon fee dividend does not currently include a rebate or credit for sequestered CO2, but if this becomes a necessary change to pass the carbon fee dividend, should CCL support it? And if so, what concerns should be addressed and how? And we had some really good discussion about, this is talking about one technology, but you could plant a tree and sequester carbon. There's technologies that we don't even know about right now that may be in the future. Overall, we were thinking that CCL should support this kind of a rebate or credit, and we talked about what would be the criteria to do that. We were thinking about how to quantify how much CO2 equivalents are captured by whatever that technology is. We need to think about the side effects or consequences of that technology. What could happen if you are disturbing underground formations and causing earthquakes and things like that. And then what is the permanence or life cycle of that technology? You plant a tree, it removes CO2, but that tree has a cycle, and then would that CO2 then be released again? Overall, we're talking about that we want to promote investment in these technologies. We want to find them because that is how we're going to help, solve the past of what we've done. The legislation already puts a price on carbon, and so if we can quantify what's removed and quantify that life cycle, what would be left is finding a mechanism for that environmental impact study or how to prove the technology before moving forward.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. We'll have a lot to say about that and then before we finish for the day. Okay, team number 7.
Okay, so our question was, the border carbon adjustment will provide a rebate to domestic carbon-intensive products that are exported. But could this prompt some industries to avoid taking steps to decrease their carbon footprint in order to keep their qualification as a rebate? In other words, if they get rebated for the cost of their fossil fuel usage, what incentive do they have to use less fossil fuel? And we've come up with a few points. One was that for most products that are exported, they're also used domestically, so there's not a rebate on that. So, as long as there's economies of scale, it would be costly for a business to set up 2 separate processes, one for domestic usage and another for export. So it would have an incentive to reduce its carbon usage. Secondly, you could set up a system of rebating based on industry average energy usage, which would basically incentivize an industry kind of as a microcosm of the whole national CDF system, where exporters that were more energy intensive than average for their industry would essentially pay those who were less energy intensive for their industry. And finally, it was pointed out that a lot of industries, to most extent, are only indirect users of fossil fuels in that they use electricity. And the electricity that they use is already, we've already provided the incentive to decarbonize the electricity sector through CDF.
Okay, great. Yeah, a lot to think about there. That idea you had about an industry average and then allowing the industry to actually put pressure on their own members. Okay, team number 8.
Yes, our question was businesses whose energy costs will rise but don't sell directly to the consumers who are getting the dividends will likely claim that the CFD will be disastrous to them, putting pressure on their representatives. And how can we respond? So that's basically, if you're a business facing, you're not going to be getting the benefits of dividends that are given to consumers. So what do we do if a business that is business facing comes to the congressperson and objectifies to the CFD? We came up with a couple points. There was a lot of discussion like there was in every other group. First of all, our idea was that business-facing industries can pass costs down to consumer-facing businesses in the short run. So that was an idea. And then also, there is not going to be a competitive disadvantage to business-facing industries when compared to all the other business-facing industries throughout the United States. So you're not going to be priced out if you have to increase your prices because of the carbon fee. And that levels the playing field.
Level playing field,
Exactly.
basically, is the response. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, we have 9 and 10 left.
Okay.
The question we had was, state and local governments have costs for energy and other products like paper that will increase in price from the carbon fee and dividend. What can we say to them to get their support other than raising taxes? The first message is that all their citizens will be getting a dividend increasing over time. And so they're going to have an increase in sales taxes. So their revenues will be going up. And the second broader message is that when the cost of something goes up, there are 2 responses that you can think about. One is conservation efficiency, and the second is substitution. Municipalities' significant costs are energy for schools, for buildings, electricity and heating, and secondly for fleets of buses and trucks. On the first, there are significant federal, state, and local programs. Use those programs that are already existing. And there's great experience across municipalities in terms of what they've done. The second message that relates to that is to use not their own money, but energy service companies. Energy service companies can bring the engineering, finance, and contracting arrangements so there'll be no upfront investment costs by municipalities. In terms of the fleets, it's an issue of substitution, turnover of fleets over time to encourage them to switch from the relatively inefficient fleets that exist to more efficient hybrid and other options that they have. We concluded that CCL and we could use some case studies of the specific responses to buildings that have been done and the savings that can be incurred to address the fear of increased costs. I've followed British Columbia very closely, and I've not seen literature on that, despite their $30 carbon tax. So I think that that is something we might consider.
Thanks, Bob. Wonderful. Just the kind of things we're looking for. Good suggestions that we can take credit for. Okay, and finally, last but not least, Team 10.
So our question reads as follows. CCL has determined that the dividend should be subject to federal income tax in order to fulfill legislative rules that require deficit neutrality, also called pay-as-you-go. How else could the CF&D bill satisfy this, and what are the implications for households? We found this to be a rather complex question, and as I listened to the other 9 groups give their answers, I realized they were each piling on another level of complexity to what we were dealing with. But I would say, we did come up with a few points which I'll mention. So first of all, one way to avoid this is to simply have Congress nullify this requirement, which is possible under the rules of Congress. It requires a heavy majority, but that anyway would be one way to deal with it. Second, we considered actually we need a slightly better understanding of the question of deficit neutrality, because obviously while some companies are going to have a deduction on their taxes, which is the central issue here, when they pay a deduction on their taxes, or they obtain a deduction for their taxes because of paying this fee, the producers pay this fee, how do we offset that in terms of the deficit? Other companies are going to be gaining relative market share and are going to be increasing the revenue they're paying to the government as well. So it's a fairly complex issue from that point of view. One way to go forward is to simply eliminate the deduction. This would be the simplest, and when we consider the general framework of trying to keep things simple, simply eliminating the deduction for the fee would be a possibility.
Oh, okay.
But on the other hand, we also consider the fact that if this was applied as stated under the rules of Congress, a progressive tax system would apply. In other words, yes, it wouldn't be a good situation, but still people at the lower end of the income level would not be paying as much tax on their dividend. So if this sounds confusing, it's because we were fairly confused by it.
As we all are.
Yeah. So I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can clarify it in questions.
That's great, because that's really what we're looking for. I mean, we don't know what Congress is going to do when the bill finally drops. We're trying to anticipate it, and I think at this point we're a little bit ahead of schedule because you folks did such a good job of reporting out, and let's hear it for all the teams. You are all honorary members of the research department, at least for now. I think what I'd like to do now is to have each of us up here, and maybe David, if you could bring whoever has the microphone. Why don't you bring it up here, and I'll have each one of us spend a minute or two talking about our thoughts on each one of these findings. So let's go back to Team 1's discussion was about methane fugitive emissions, and you mentioned 3 methods, which were to, and I'm not sure if I got them in the right order, okay, to have an X prize for finding methods for measuring methane losses or methane leakage. The second one was to just apply an industry standard and to phase it in slowly. And then the third one was to put the question to industry to come up with verifiable methods that could be applied to apply the carbon tax to that. We've talked about this a lot in our research department and what we should be thinking of. Right now, the technologies are still in their infancy to actually measure and verify methane leakage and the kind of amounts that are with the kind of rigor that would be needed to apply a carbon fee. You also mentioned the fact that there's a lot of methane loss from methane emissions from other sources. So that's what I would say right now is that we are in the process of monitoring the developments very carefully, but we do want to address it.
Could you put the questions back up?
Oh, yeah, let me put the questions back up. Okay, so this is kind of the short version of it. How do we address fugitive methane emissions? So Danny, why don't you make a comment?
I think that I won't add that much to what Rick said. I think that's about it. What I try and do is I try and remember the overall picture. And you look at the last IPCC report, they break down what are the emissions from CO2, what are the emissions from methane, what are the emissions from all the different greenhouse gases. And a big source of concern among climate advocates is the uncertainty about how much methane is leaking from any one place. But when you average that across the entire atmosphere, there isn't uncertainty. And when you look at those IPCC reports, they attribute specific warming to CO2 and to methane, and the bigger problem remains CO2. And so even though there is uncertainty about methane emissions from any one given source, we know what the methane concentration in the atmosphere is when it's averaged, and CO2 is the bigger problem. So one of the things that I try and keep in mind here is that whatever we do, however we address this, and we do have to account for the politics, and there are difficult, tricky politics here, methane should not trip up CO2. That's the big problem we need to solve. That's still the more difficult, the more serious problem that needs to be solved. So that's the only thing that I would add there.
Okay, anything, Alan?
Well, this is far from my area of expertise, but I do recall that there have been there's been a lack of compliance with various methane emission standards. I don't know if it's at the federal or the state level. And one thing that could be done is simply to crack down and have more enforcement of the standards. But that would not address agricultural methane, which is a very substantial portion. Do we tell people they can't eat meat? I mean, cows are really one of the big problems. We can specify or require the cows be fed different kinds of feed, which does reduce methane. So there are things that can be done, but there's cost-benefit analysis on each one of them. There's probably no one overall method of addressing the problem, but we may be able to come at the edges little by little and have some impact on methane.
I want to make another comment, which I remembered as the other gentlemen were talking, that there are EPA rules to reduce methane emissions through identifying where the leaks are coming from and finding technical solutions. And the industry had been required to do more rigorous measurements of what they're losing and then take steps to, for example, replace pressure controllers that vent methane as part of their design with those that do not. And of course, a lot of that stuff is not being fought by the current administration, but as far as I know, it still hasn't been eliminated. So that's another method to address this, is to make sure that those programs stay in place. Right, it's called enforcement. Okay, so let me open it up for questions, a few questions on that topic, right up here. Wait. I'm sorry, we couldn't.
She asked, she's read that the EPA is underreporting methane, and there's a certain tipping point at which leaked methane makes natural gas worse than coal.
Right. Oh, boy.
I study. I can comment on it, but can I use the microphone?
Sure, yeah. The microphone, and then I'll say something.
So it's true that methane, a different point of view on methane, which I hold, is that it is more important than CO2 right now, because because it only has an atmospheric life of 9 years, and it constitutes about 20% of the problem we're facing, whereas CO2 has an atmospheric life of maybe 30,000 years. You know, there's a very wide span on what the average life of CO2 is. That bringing methane under control is important because it will slow down the immediate problem we're facing toward tipping points, whereas the underlying problem of CO2 has to be continuously applied anyway. So to avoid tipping points and unknown feedbacks, it is important that we address methane. And my understanding is that the satellite measurements that will come from the launch that's coming in next year are supposed to offer a degree of specificity about methane sourcing that might allow you to even be able to tell what a given feedlot is emitting.
Okay.
So I think that the technology is moving us toward a way to measure methane, and I think that the importance of bringing methane under control needs to be looked at.
A couple of things to add to that to address the young lady's comments back there about EPA underreporting methane. I think the controversy that you referred to is because the EPA was gathering data from industry, and the suspicion is, of course, that industry will underreport their methane because they know that overreporting is certainly not going to help them. But the program that they put in place for reducing methane, my understanding is, while it was active, has been quite successful because they got very specific about what type of equipment. It turns out that most of there's two things. Most of the methane leakage is from certain specific types of equipment, and most of it is also from a few really bad actors. You may have heard about methane leakage or methane emissions measurements in the Four Corners area of the Southwest, and it turns out that there are a few operators in that area that just were not in compliance with any of the rules. So one of the things we can also do is to try to focus efforts on the bad actors. The other question is about methane being worse than coal. I always kind of cringe whenever I read a report from an environmental group that says X is worse than coal, because it's like the worst thing you can say about anybody or anything. But the fact is that if you look at the calculations, replacing coal-fired electricity with natural gas-fired electricity, you'd have to get up to about 6 or 7% leakage before you would be worse than coal. And no producer is going to tolerate that kind of leakage. But that said, we really do need to continue looking at how we can document the leakage that we have. Let's move on to another question about the undocumented status, completely different issue. The suggestion was that we should consider allowing the states to, if I understand it correctly, to look at the data on people that are eligible through Social Security numbers and then the numbers of people that actually live in that state, and then let the state figure out how to distribute that extra money that represents the people that are undocumented. I would point out that there is a type of identification number called the individual tax ID number, which people who are not eligible for Social Security can apply for, and some percentage of undocumented residents actually have those, because then they can be used to, I'm not sure, maybe Alan would probably be the best person to answer that, of how that works.
Actually, there's probably 3 classes of undocumented people in this regard. A number of them, one way or another, pay their taxes, apparently a significant percentage. Now, whether it's because they use their spouse's Social Security number or they use stolen Social Security numbers, they are paying their taxes. They file taxes. Those people would be covered because they're in the system. The I-10 people are more problematic. Typically, those are people, for example, who have investments in the United States, live abroad and have to pay some kind of tax, have to pay taxes. So something called an equivalent of a social security number is used, so IRS can handle their taxes. Merrill Lynch can send out their 1099, et cetera. But I think there's a more then there's people who are completely off the system. Now, I guess I have to be the bad guy and say, if people are completely off the system, do we really want to give them a dividend? I think that's something we really have to consider. They probably would pay some carbon fee, but they're probably not paying income tax or other taxes, so they're taking money from other people. I think in this regard, there is a relatively simple solution to a lot of the undocumented problem. That's making businesses verify Social Security numbers. The system has been around, God, it must be close to 20 years. I remember tinkering with it a long time ago. Businesses strenuously resist having to use that. They know they're on the hook if they don't use it, but they sort of are willing to take their chances in the lottery. If we really enforce that, undocumented people would not be able to work. That would help stop undocumented people from coming in for economic reasons. So it's a very complicated issue, and I don't think there's a simple solution.
I'll just add the politics here, in that there's an immigration debate which is happening now, and you guys are going to encounter that in your meetings on Tuesday. And a lot of people are unhappy that this debate has been forced. And part of the reason they're unhappy is because immigration is such a contentious issue. And so one thing I've always said is, trying to solve both immigration and climate change in one bill is it's probably too much to ask. And so I'll just add in that, it'd be great if we could have more ways of attacking this, but tacking on two very contentious issues into one bill is probably bad politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reason I presented that question is, of course, because some members of Congress are very concerned about it, and we want to be able to at least offer ideas. And it's not an easy one, as Alan says. I think we had a question. Well, a couple of them. Okay. Let's start with the lady right in the front here. Yeah.
How easy is it for an undocumented person in the U.S.? I mean, what do you require from them in order to pay out a dividend?
Okay, the question is, what would we require of an undocumented person to receive a dividend? Well, I don't know how to answer that question. Let Alan.
Well, these are all hypotheticals, obviously. But as I said, if they're covered by an income tax return, and many are, they would automatically get the dividend.
I'm sorry, they would do what?
They would automatically
get the dividend if they were covered by an income tax.
If they have a Social Security number or somebody
Right.
in their immediate family has it.
I've hypothesized that people who don't file income tax returns would file the claim for dividend. Then you'd have the enforcement issue or the legal issue in setting up the system. Do you require a Social Security number on that in order to be valid? For example, you can't get the earned income credit for kids unless you have a Social Security number. So that is basically a congressional decision, a legislative decision.
Okay.
And until you make that kind of decision, it's hard to answer. But whatever decision you make legislatively, then you have the enforcement issue. If they put down a phony number, does IRS cross-check and see if that kid has already been claimed on another return? Do they see if that Social Security number is for someone who's deceased for the last 40 years? You have all those issues. Now, quite frankly, probably in the last 15 to 20 years, IRS does a pretty good job of checking the validity of Social Security numbers on tax returns, mainly because of the earned income credit abuse or potential abuse. So it depends on what the legislation is and what the enforcement is.
A lady all the way in the back there had a question as well.
I was on the team that addressed this issue, and one of the things that may not have come across in the final report is that, at least my understanding of the carbon fee dividend is that we're talking about consumers, and ultimately those who would receive the dividends are consumers, and presumably if you're living in a location, some kind of housing, let's just go out on a limb and assume that each one has an electric bill, and that there's a bill or a meter associated with each address. And so again, we're getting back away from, like, Danny was saying, that we're not trying to tackle this political issue, we're just looking at them as consumers, people who have bought products that have been affected by the fee. And so as consumers, if they have an electric bill, that they can go to, maybe something within, at the state level or at the municipality level, and show that their bill is there, their address does not show on a database that indicates that they've gotten some kind of a carbon dividend, that they can then receive either maybe a credit on this bill or something. And then if they want to further clarify their situation as to the number of people at the house, they can file the forms for that and find out a way. But that there's a way of identifying consumers via their address or their
Yeah.
electrical meter or something like that.
Okay, there was one more question over here, I think.
I was wondering how would the dreamers and people on the temporary work permit will qualify under that question? Because they're undocumented, but however, they're integrated on the economy. They have work permits, some of them have social security, so, and they're undocumented. So
Yeah.
consider like a regular person that have social security, that's part of the economy, that get income tax.
Yeah, the easiest way out of this is for somebody to pass immigration reform, so everybody gets counted in the system somehow, but we can't make that happen. But yeah, it is a good question. Do we have different kind of status if you're a dreamer? And I don't know. We probably need to move on to another question, but I think just it's good that everybody is giving thought to this. Is somebody? Okay, one more back there, Ellen.
Question. You know, we've seen the complexity in this discussion with all the factors involved in trying to put together legislation with Congress. So is a bill going to be dropped first, and this is going to be worked out? These factors are going to be worked out? That is, the congressman has to deal with these factors and work them out and then present a bill?
Well, Danny's got the answer to that.
It's a mix. Some of these questions are going to have to be addressed before a bill is dropped, and we've already thought through an answer, and we've written that down. But a lot of them we're not going to know the answer to, and that'll be on the backside. So Congress can be quite general, and they can leave it up to other agencies to answer a lot of these. So there is a mix of front end versus back end, and we've done the ones that need to be addressed, we've taken a good crack at, but we've already gotten a lot of great ideas here, and in the negotiation process, having other suggestions is going to be very useful. So I think that hopefully you're learning a lot here, but we're also getting some great ideas from you. So that's increasing the size of our toolkit.
Now I'd like
Let
to
me point to the real world again. I know about tax bills a little, but I think it happens the same in most other areas. A committee passes a provision in a tax bill. They say, yeah, we want to do X, Y, we want, this doesn't work?
It's a directional mix.
You got to point it right at your mouth.
What do I have to do?
Speak out in the middle of it like it's
Oh, this way, oh, I'm sorry, okay. Congress said, committee says, okay, we're going to do X, Y, Z. Then it goes to the drafting people. And the people sit around and they come up with all these provisions. What has not been covered? And then they negotiate. The staffs negotiate most of these things to the extent possible. Most of the time, that never goes back to the committee. Whatever the staff does is accepted. That's one level. And then when Congress really can't decide anything, they say, the Secretary of X has our permission to issue regulations to cover this. It's known as punting. And then, of course, when the Secretary of X comes up with regulations, Congress feels free to clamor and scream their heads off that it's not what they intended. But they never knew what they intended. So basically, these things come down to the nitty-gritty. There's probably thousands of these decisions that have to be made in a program like this.
Stop. Okay. Let's talk about the question from the from the third team. We're only on three now. About children that are in foster care or in institutional care. And I know that, Alan, you wanted to talk about this one.
Again, there's no one-size-fits-all here. You talked about foster kids generally cannot be claimed as dependents. Well, there are exceptions to that. It depends on how long they're in the foster care of a particular person, who's actually supporting them. It also depends on whether their biological parents are claiming them. Institutionalized kids, where there's basically in some kind of orphanage, are even more of a problem. But the question is, who is supporting these kids? Generally, it's the state or the federal government. So if we're going to pay out a dividend, you have to ask yourself, who should the dividend go to? Should the institution supporting the kids get the dividend? Or, okay, you see the issues. And you can come up with hypotheticals, you can come up with specific criteria, but somebody has to do that.
Yeah, the reason I even included that question was just, I guess maybe I have a secretly criminal mind. I'm always thinking, how can I game the system to make money for myself? And which I never successfully do, but I like to read about people who are successful. Anyway, thinking that there are people who will say, boy, if I can get a dividend for each one of these kids. Of course, if there's a 2-child per family limit, then they don't have the incentive. But now, will that be a disincentive for people to take on foster children? Because to say, well, if I don't get a dividend for them, then why would I do this? When other people are getting dividends.
If the state gets the dividend, if the state were to get the dividend, they could raise the payments to the foster families.
There you go. So,
great
idea.
Again,
A couple of questions that started. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
It just seems like as soon as you're giving any money to states, you can kiss revenue neutrality goodbye. And that just seems like a really big concern, given that we're sort of betting the farm on revenue neutrality.
I
don't know if I'd say that, if I would agree with that.
It seems that as soon as you give money to the states, you're kissing revenue neutrality goodbye.
Because it's money that's being recycled from the carbon fees back into the economy. So if you're giving a dividend to to the state-run institution, that's supposed to account for the increased costs that they're incurring in their running their institution.
Yeah, but there's another point to that too. If the state is using carbon and paying the tax, then, or nonprofit is doing that, they don't have tax deductibility. So they're paying the full amount of the carbon fee.
Right.
That's different than a business where now there's a 21% corporate income tax, or an individual can be up to high 30%, where essentially there's a revenue loss. But for a state or an nonprofit, there is no tax, therefore they're paying 100% of the fee.
More questions? I'm sorry, more questions on this topic all the way in the back?
Well, if we can figure out an answer to the question, that's great. But if we can't, a lot of these kids turn 18 and time out of the system and have nothing. Literally, there are charities that raise money to get them a pot, or something like that. So I would say if we can't figure it out,
an interesting idea to set up a fund for children that they could cash in when they when they reach their majority.
How did they do it in Alaska with the oil money?
I don't know. I don't know.
That's a great question.
Yeah, something we should look into. One more question on this topic or comment.
How wedded is CCL to the two-child per family limit, given that in our modern society, families are not binary anymore, and it seems to complexify things politically and practically?
Actually, it really hasn't come up that much. I think in the 8 years I've been lobbying on this, I can remember 2 offices who brought it up. So I think that we picked it for reasons, but we are committed to creating the political will for a livable world. I don't think that actually the driver there is the rate of increase. And so if it became necessary to change that to get a deal, we change it if we could get the rate of increase.
One point, and I should probably let Alan answer it, but it was in your paper. Did some calculations showing what happens to the average dividend for all residents if you eliminate the two-child limit. One thing that concerns people I've talked to is that one of the type of resident that is going to not do well under the carbon fee and dividend is an elderly person living alone in a house that they own. Because single residents of a standalone house actually have much higher energy costs than a family living in that same size of house. So people on a fixed income who are elderly it may not turn out very well for them. Well, if you were to give dividends to families for all their children, you would actually reduce the pool of money that would go to those residents. If you understand what I'm saying, it would reduce the size of the overall pool. And so we don't want to disadvantage people in that situation. That has nothing to do with the reason that we originally put the two-child limit, I don't think, but it is a factor.
I'll just point out, just a couple of weeks ago, Alan revised his study, and for the first time it was made available on our public site. So it is available for you to read, and he has an entire section which actually envisages different formulations of the dividend formula. And so, like I said, for us, CCL, the important part is the fee and the rate of increase. And what Alan did basically is provide policymakers with the consequences of their actions. I think he says in the paper this is ultimately a political decision, and he's given them and you the information to evaluate what are the consequences in dollars and cents of this. And so I'll actually, Alan, if you want to comment on that further.
Give me a second.
Right. Okay. Any other questions on that issue? The young lady in the red shirt there.
Well, my question isn't about that issue specifically, but it's back to the issue of revenue neutrality. I'm from Canada, so I'm not really all that familiar with tax system down here. But am I correct in understanding that CCL is accepting that the dividends are going to be taxed?
That's correct.
Then where does revenue neutrality go?
The definition of revenue neutrality is that the deficit of the federal government neither grows nor decreases over a 10-year period. There is a widespread misconception, which we really need to clean up, that revenue neutrality just means you return all the revenue. That's not what it means. It means the deficit of the federal government neither increases or decreases over a 10-year period.
Well, if all that money that is being collected from the oil, which goes to places and diagrams and stuff, goes into some pot,
Yes.
and then it's distributed to the people, and then, I don't know, half or a third or whatever of it is taxed back. How does that not increase the base?
Because there is what's known as the 25% offset. And I'll just give a quick thing. The reason is, the simplest thing that I can say is that because you raise that pot, but companies that you're assessing the fee on, they write off other taxes. So another pot of money shrinks. And if you return 100%, the federal government is actually assumed to get 25% less revenue. So that's the simplest thing. But Alan really is, he's an expert on this, so.
Well, there are assumptions and then there's reality. There's basically the Congressional Committee's budget, Congressional Budget Office assumes 25% offset. But if you look at it, let's go back to pre-2018. I don't want to think about the changes yet. Basically, you had corporate taxes in the mid-30s. So when the fee was being collected, there was about a 30 to 35% offset because of tax saving. When the dividend would be paid, the average marginal tax rate for individuals is something like 12 or 13%. So if you give up the 25% assumption, you go into it, there's a spread in there. You're losing more money on the fee side than you're gaining on the rebate side. So there's still a loss. Now, fortunately, the Congressional Budget Office says if you tax it, you've made up the loss. It's probably not true, but it's to our benefit to accept that assumption. Let me go back to the other thing. I was just trying to look for my calculation here. If we gave dividends to all kids, the per resident dividend would go down about 11%. That's a very rough number. I didn't have good information. If I was still at Treasury, I could have done better at that, but nothing's published that really gives a distribution of the number of kids.
Okay. Just one last comment. Danny and I have had a few discussions about the taxability of the dividend. There are certain assumptions that economists make and that the Congressional Budget Office makes that we have to take into account for political reasons as well. That's why we arrived at the assumption that if we can, let me just go back to the question of what taxes are being lost. If, say, a company that uses a lot of fossil fuel is paying a carbon fee, part of the way that they're going to make up for that carbon fee is by perhaps reducing wages or reducing their investment. And so there are certain taxes paid to the federal government that are going to go down. They're not going to pass all of the costs on to consumers. And so it becomes very complicated and difficult for economists to predict what's going to happen. They make certain assumptions, and we have to live with those. So I guess I'll just stay with that. Let's move on to Brian Ettling's question. This was the one group from Group 4 that was not one of the questions that we had on the board. And correct me if I don't remember it correctly, but the question from a climate skeptic you had is that if you reduce fossil fuel use, you're going to be reducing the dividend payments. And so won't people end up not being able to cover the cost of energy? If you reduce fossil fuel use, you're going to be reducing the amount of carbon costs that people are incurring. So the dividend and the carbon costs they're incurring year by year should always be in balance, more or less. Now, and of course we assume that fossil fuel use is going to go down, and the thing that we hope happens is that the dividend eventually will go away, because there's no reason to be paying the dividend if people aren't seeing increased costs from carbon tax. Now, of course, another question is whether energy costs will go up and stay up as fossil energy is replaced by renewable energy or other unforeseen innovations. And that opens up the whole question of what role is innovation going to play in the energy future that we hope will happen. And I've been actually collecting incidences of innovative technologies that very few people know about because they haven't been commercialized, but will have a very large impact on fossil fuel emissions in the future. And I think that we can at least make a statement that there is a lot of stuff that's going to happen that is unforeseen that will not increase costs. But that said, we also have to take into account, and this may not satisfy your climate skeptic, the fact that if we don't do something about fossil fuel emissions, the cost to the economy of climate change is going to be very, very significant. And so it's the avoided costs of damage to the economy that we're trying to address. And this is a big problem with addressing climate skeptics is there's this embedded notion that we're putting the environment over people. And that's not what we do at CCL. We're looking at the impact on future generations of unmitigated climate change. So that's probably the best way to talk about that.
So I wonder why CCL's economic studies like REMI, et cetera, and your research program don't produce these damage estimates. Is it because it's really hard to do?
It's because, well, I don't know if Danny, maybe you can say a little more about that.
The question is, why don't we produce these damage estimates? And I mean, for me, the people we need to convince won't believe them. And so I think that that's the thing. I think you need to argue at a handicap on terms that they've accepted. If you are arguing against people who just, do not accept the premise that the climate is changing, then they're not going to accept, well, you've basically gone past what they've accepted. And so you need to argue within the world of premises which they have accepted. And if we do give that to our volunteers, you could argue that for some people, but if they haven't accepted that premise, you're going to be basically wasting your time. So from my view, it's about recognizing who do you actually need to convince and what information are they willing to accept into their worldview and their calculations of how to move forward.
Yeah, I would also want to just add, and I'll get to more questions, that the rigor of the estimates of what climate damages will be is something that's relatively new as well. Very few economists have really wanted to tackle that. I mean, there's the so-called social costs of carbon, which only really accounts for a small percentage of what the actual damages are expected to be. So that's a developing area of research that may in the future be able to give us much better answers. Like I would like to be able to say, hey, Hurricane Harvey caused $280 billion of damage, and this percentage of it was caused by climate change. We can't do that yet. And it's a separate issue from what Danny's talking about. But even for those that are convinced, it would be great to be able to put numbers on it. And there may come a time when we can really do that. Gentleman had a question? Yeah, right there.
One problem I have with the revenue report is in the first decade, it's fairly believable. But going from the 30 to 50% reductions, and then it starts to level off. I have two questions. One, what assumptions about the price sensitivity of fossil fuels are being made in the revenue report to come up with that projection? And two, they not consider the idea of there actually being a tipping point where we need to go from 50% to 90% reduction in fossil fuels. That's what the climate scientists are telling us we need to do. I will, in my talks, publicly will say, well, once we've gotten 50%, we're well on our way, and sort of gloss over the idea, well, how do we get to 90%? So those are a bunch of questions around the long-term projections that
Yeah, the reason it slows down after 10 years is because we've already gotten rid of the coal by that point, and so it's harder to get further reductions. It uses the 2013 annual energy report from the Energy and Information Administration, which is already out of date by the time the study came out. It came out in 2014. It took 2 months to do when they started. 2013 was the most recent. Halfway through 2014 came out. It was too late. And so they don't assume technology change. And then as to why, how do we get that other things? They're just assuming one thing. They changed one thing. So REMI, they run a base case and then they run an alternative case. In that alternative case, the only thing they changed was that gradually increasing carbon price. And so if that's the only thing you're doing, those are the results you're getting. And so the REMI study is conservative in a lot of ways. CCL isn't going to just say, yay, for 20 years and rest on carbon fee and dividend. We're going to go, this is the best first step, we're going to take the best second step, and then the best third step. There are going to be other policy tweaks which we are going to emphasize to you after this gets passed. And so that is, and also technology is going to change. The REMI study did not assume technology change any more rapidly than was outlined in that 2013 annual energy report, which, as I said, was already out of date. It was too conservative, even when that report came out. So, and I feel good about taking a conservative report to the public, to members of Congress, as it's going to be this or better. I feel good about that.
Yeah, it's very difficult for economists and energy modelers who are collaborations between engineers and economists to predict what's going to happen with technology. It's just too many things that can happen, the black swan and so on, the big breakthrough. I just read about something the other day about a method that a small company came up with to improve the quality of electric power to users that they say could save as much as 50% on electricity use at the point of use. And so if this were used universally, and if it really worked the way they said, you could get 50% emissions reduction from the power sector without doing anything else and still burn coal and oil or gas, whatever. And so there are things in the pipeline which the economists can't know about, or even if they know about it, they have no way to model it. So that's why a study like REMI is actually very conservative. Am I missing any questions from the back there? I think Brian had one.
I had my hand raised before because
Okay.
I wanted to address a comment about the topic of climate skeptics for one, and the lack of estimates of climate damages for another. And I would urge this group, as it has done, to continue, never to try to estimate climate damages, because it's something we could be attacked on, because they're inherently very uncertain. And to climate skeptics, I would use that very uncertainty as an argument as to why we have to do something. I would also say, that, the same argument really applies to the REMI study and the conservative assumptions that you've made there, the wisdom of me.
Brian had something?
I did want to respond, Danny, that you make a great point that you'll never convince skeptics. But in a community setting, what happens is that oftentimes the skeptics have great questions, and there's other people in the room that are undecided. And we're trying to decide between you and the skeptic. And that's what we have. This is an excellent opportunity to really arm ourselves with the tool to answer for the undecided room. Also, my experience with Toastmasters was when I sincerely researched and answered their questions, I was able to help shift the skeptics a little bit more to where I was at too. So yeah, you're not going to convince them, but it's for the others in the room that are undecided. But it also does reach them a little bit too if you're honest and sincere answering their question.
You're perfectly right, Brian, but my frame of reference, I actually don't envision such settings. I envision the congressional office, where there is actually one person in the room who you're trying to convince. And so that's just what I default to, as to the extent that I influence where we're going. Yeah.
And we don't shy away from talking about what what the evidence shows us. I mean, we say 97% of scientists and so on. And if those who we are talking to don't even want to listen, well, they won't listen. But there are a few Bob Inglis's out there.
I'd just like to make a suggestion to the room that we use the term that Catherine Hayhoe suggested, which I've been using for a while, dismissives rather than skeptics, because, well,
True.
perhaps we can change our language a little bit. That may be helpful in our
We only have about 6 minutes left, so let's just, any other questions you have on any other topic, but it should be related to policy, because that's what we're really here to explore. Rather than go back through the questions that the teams raised, let's just open it up.
I had a question from the get-go, and I know a couple other people in my group have heard them asking the same question. Why are we not rebating the fees paid on the exports of fossil fuels themselves? So for instance, if I understand you correctly, a U.S. producer of natural gas is assessed a fee on the carbon content of natural gas when it gets combusted. And they, if they were going to export that natural gas, they would not be rebated for the fee that they were charged. And I want to understand the logic behind that.
Yeah, the thinking is that these are global commodities. And really what you're doing, so in that framework, the way we've set it up, it's more of a severance fee than it is a carbon tax. A severance fee, when you sever a fossil fuel from the earth, you pay a fee. That is what the Alaska program is. It's a severance fee. And so from that standpoint, it's really about there's no opportunity to ever pull that back up again. You have depleted a resource from the United States which can never be replenished. And so this is one argument. There are a couple arguments here. So from that standpoint, the United States has fewer options into the future, and those should stay domestically. The more climate argument, this is a little bit different than it was. The context is a little bit different. In the context in which this policy was developed, few other countries had carbon prices in place. So the idea was that if this fuel was exported, it would bear the fee. Other countries would be forced to pay that fee, or they'd be forced to buy from a reduced supply, which would raise prices. It was a forcing mechanism to get other countries to pay higher prices anyway, hopefully reduce their emissions. Now that other countries do have a larger portion of countries, wealthy countries, the biggest users of fossil fuels, do have some sort of carbon pricing, I would say that's less important. But that's why. That was the original thinking.
Well, if I may just respond, I mean, we're considering exporting a lot of natural gas to Mexico. The United States right now has a lot of natural gas. Mexico has a lot of oil. So if we were to export natural gas to Mexico, Mexico would be substituting the use of oil with natural gas to some extent. And that would be reducing their carbon emissions. Or if we were to export to China, which is poor in natural gas and rich in coal, they would be substituting coal for natural gas.
What about the case where it works the other way around, where the coal producers, the coal miners find, hey, we got to pay a carbon fee here, but if we sell our coal to India or China, we get a rebate on the carbon fee. So let's go, guys. This is the only way we're going to survive. So it can work in both directions there. Anything else? The gentleman back there.
I just want to make a point. This is my first CCL conference, and I'm a little surprised, actually, that there seems to be a bit of a sense that there isn't good work on updating the social costs of carbon and potential damages and assessment of carbon damages. I think there is. I think there's a pretty credible and fast-growing body of literature out there. I just did a real quick Google here, and actually just came up with the National Academies of Science, National Academy of Engineering, and National Academy of Medicine, which are all working together. Actually, we just produced a report this 2017. So I just wanted to say that because I'm a little shocked to actually kind of hear that being dismissed. That work is there. It really should be.
You've just given me an idea that we should start a project and a database on CCL community to collect that data and start looking at it.
Can I make a comment? I just feel compelled to say something.
Go, sure.
I agree with this gentleman wholeheartedly. I would tell you that, at least for coastal communities, looking at the costs of the consequences of climate effects is the single most influential factor for having communities at least deal with climate change from an adaptation standpoint rather than a mitigation standpoint. If you look at coastal communities, it is vulnerability analyses that look at the consequences of sea level rise and storm impacts that are motivating communities to plan accordingly.
climate damages.
CFD.
Yeah.
And it gives them an additional incentive to back this up. There's a great literature around the country. It's usually compiled state by state. The studies you're referring to are national aggregations, but if you go state by state and look at which counties, what municipalities are doing these kinds of economic studies, they're remarkably numerous. And it's economists and climate scientists working together.
I don't want to give the impression that that we're disregarding those things, but the problem is that the people that do the economic modeling, it's very, very hard to convince them to go beyond the social costs of carbon. I just read something today that Ted Nordhaus, very famous economist who was really behind the social costs of carbon development originally, I think, has written some papers about what kind of damage we would see from a 6-degree temperature rise. And it looks very, very bad, as you might imagine. And that the economic impact using standard economic modeling techniques is that the world would lose 10% of GDP, even though everybody would be, people wouldn't be able to work. I mean, the cities would be wiped out. So there's a great disconnect between what you can get modelers to accept and what we know is going to happen. And it would be great to be able to bridge that gap. But that's something that CCL is not equipped to do on our own. We have to look at what other people have done and to kind of act as the intermediaries to convince others to use it. One last question, and then we're going to...
Just to add to this, it seems to me the strongest argument for the carbon fee is that it should reflect the cost down the road of pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere today to deal with the externality, to internalize it. We need a measure of what that cost is in order to talk about how large our fee should be.
Well, we'd need another hour, I think, to address that one. But, yeah. I want to thank all of you for putting up with us for 3 hours. And thanks to my guests, Alan Lerman and Danny, and all of you. Enjoy the conference. Good night.